I'm very proud to be part of that party and to commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good contribution. Mr. Speaker.
This is a split call.
It is a split.
Phil Twyford, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labor is, of course, as my colleagues have pointed out, supporting this bill. We support the inclusion of these 3 areas in marine reserves, and they are a treasure that belong to this country, sir, and they are part of the World Heritage Network, and it's the right thing that they are included as part of marine reserves, and we congratulate the work of the Minister in getting the legislation to this point. I want to just make a few comments about the general state of the marine reserves legislation, and note that this bill basically uses special legislation to achieve marine reserve status for these subantarctic islands. They're not being set up, the reserves are not being set up under the law that currently exists for the creation of marine reserves, and that is the Marine Reserves Act of 1971. That legislation, now 40 years old, is cumbersome. It was ahead of its time when it was passed and highly rated, but no longer. That legislation has been left behind by international best practice, and unfortunately, in spite of the fact that I think many New Zealanders applaud the goal of achieving 10% of our waters declared marine reserves, this has been a very difficult issue over the last couple of decades. And I think the Minister will probably agree that primary legislation is in dire need of an overhaul. And I think that most parties in this House would agree that work needs to be done to find a mechanism that can work in the kind of political and social realities of New Zealand conservation policy today. It was difficult, I think, under the time of the last Labor government when efforts were made to revamp that law and reform it, but the numbers in this House were not there. There was not majority support to reform the marine reserves legislation and update it. I hope, sir, that now there is majority support for reforming that legislation, because it is long overdue. The regulatory impact statement, sir, for this bill points out that the average time to establish a marine reserve under the Marine Reserves Act is about 12 years. It ranges between 1 and 23 years, and that clearly is not good enough. The Environmental Defence Society released a publication last year that I thought made some very good points. They argued for the need to overhaul the legislation and produce a Marine Reserves Act that allows for the efficient promulgation of marine reserves, for the creation of a network of different types of marine protected areas, all the way from no-take areas right through to full protected reserves. And I believe that we need that kind of legislation. I spent much of last week, sir, kayaking around the Waitemata Harbour in the Hauraki Gulf in Auckland, looking at conservation issues, talking to many of the movers and shakers within the Hauraki Gulf Marine Forum, which is a collaborative governance model set up to advance the agenda of preserving the Hauraki Gulf for future generations, cleaning it up, addressing issues of water quality, and protecting biodiversity. The establishment of marine reserves, and in fact establishing a 10% of the Hauraki Gulf earmarked as marine reserves, is one of the key elements in that agenda, sir, to protect, to allow crayfish and snapper and other species to regenerate beyond current stock levels, so that the ecosystems can be restored and repaired, and the Gulf protected for future generations. Marine reserves is one of the really big challenges that we have. I hope that the Hauraki Gulf Marine Forum can achieve something like 10% of the Hauraki Gulf set aside. It's a big ask, and I hope that as well as establishing reformed marine reserve legislation in this House, we see on the ground in places like the Subantarctic Islands and places like the Hauraki Gulf, we actually see real practical progress on the ground. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Eugenie Sage.